We're going to start by setting up an AuthStateListener. Why? Well, our app has two states, signed in and signed out. And we need a way to determine which of these states the app is in. An AuthStateListener is a listener which we attach to the Firebase Auth object. It executes whenever the authentication state changes. This includes when the listener is first attached and Firebase Auth is initialized. In that way, as soon as the user opens the app, you can know what state they're in. Our listener will have the code for both setting up after you sign in and tearing the UI down after they sign out. So the code in the AuthStateListener will determine what to show the user. Following best practices, we'll attach the listener in onResume when the app is started and visible. And we'll also clean up the listener by detaching it in onPause when the app is no longer visible. It's important to remember to attach and detach the listener, especially because now we're showing multiple activities in the app. The first is the activity when you're signed in, which is our main activity, and the other activity is the login flow that's shown when you're signed out. Note that the activities with the login flow are generated by AuthUI. You want to make sure to be careful not to attach the same listener more than once as you navigate back and forth between the two states. But for now, we'll just worry about setting up the AuthStateListener and having it launch our sign-in screen if the user's not logged in. If the user is logged in, for now, we'll just show a toast. Okay, enough talk, time to create. I'm here in main activity, and as with any Firebase service, the first thing that you're going to need to do is get an instance of the class. And in this case, the class is called Firebase Auth. I'll make an instance variable for it right here. I will also need a variable for my authentication state listener. So I'll make that right here. Okay, and now let's initialize Firebase Auth. So I'm going to scroll down to onCreate, and right after I initialize the database, I will initialize my auth object. And I do it in a similar way to how I initialized my Firebase database object. I call the static method getInstance on Firebase Auth. And I also need to initialize my authentication state listener, and I'm going to do that at the bottom of onCreate. So let me scroll down. And here at the bottom, I'm going to say m AuthStateListener equals new authentication state listener. Right now you've created your authentication state listener, but you haven't attached it yet. If you remember what I said before, you're going to do that in onResume. So let's scroll down, and we're going to add both onResume and onPause. So here in onResume, I'm going to add the authentication state listener, and I'll do that by calling on my Firebase Auth object add authentication state listener, and I'll pass in the listener. And then up here on onPause, I'm going to do the corresponding removal of the listener. And that's just using the remove AuthStateListener method. Okay, so I'm adding it and I'm removing it as the activity is in the foreground and then no longer in the foreground. So at this point we have a listener, it's getting added and it's good to go, but if we scroll up to our actual definition of it, it is not actually doing anything. So what you want to do is to actually check if the user is logged in or not. And then if they're not logged in, you're going to show them that login screen. Now in this onAuthStateChanged method, you're given this parameter here, this Firebase Auth parameter. And the difference between this Firebase Auth parameter and the one that you initialized up here is that this one is guaranteed to contain whether at that moment the user is authenticated or not. And this variable has two states. It's either signed in or it's signed out. Okay, so I'm going to use this variable to get something called a Firebase user. And then I can check if the user is actually logged in by seeing if this Firebase user is null or not. So here are our two cases. The user is signed in if the user is not null, or they're signed out if they are null. And here, where the user is signed out, is where you want to launch the sign-in flow. And that's where Firebase UI comes in. Firebase UI is spectacular because with just one call, it'll start this whole sign-in flow for us. Over in Firebase UI's auth README, they have a couple of sign-in examples. And this one here is actually the closest to what we want. It enables sign-in with some providers. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And then over here, if the user is signed out, I'm going to go ahead and call that method to start the sign-in flow. With a few small changes, I'm going to get rid of this Facebook provider because we're not using Facebook authentication for our chat app. And here I'm going to do something called disabling smart lock by setting is smart lock enabled to false. Smart lock allows the phone to sort of automatically save the user's credentials and try to log them in. But for our simple learning purposes, we're not going to be using it. You might also notice that you're passing in this RC sign-in constant. If I scroll up, I'll see that I'm doing this static import, and I actually don't want to do that. Android Studio just kind of automatically added it for me. I want to define this constant myself. So up here, I'm going to add a public static final integer, and I'm going to call it RC signin, and we'll set it equal to 1. The RC here stands for request code. And if we scroll back down to where we use it, so RC signin is passed in down here to start activity for result, and it's a flag for when we return from starting the activity for the result. And I promise we'll be using this shortly, so hold tight on this one. Finally, when the user's signed in, I'm just going to add a quick little toast. Okay, and here's the toast. We want to be able to know when the user actually successfully signs in with the login flow, which is why I'm adding this. Okay, so let's try running the code now. So you'll see that instead of going straight to the chat messages, you now see this sign-in flow. This sign-in flow was brought to you by Firebase UI, which is pretty nifty considering that you only had to write this one line of code here. Okay, so I'm going to say sign in with email, and Firebase UI actually deals with the entire login flow for that. So I'll enter my email here, and then it's smart enough to know that I don't have an account yet, so I could give it my name and a password. Okay, and then I'll save it. Now that I'm successfully logged in, I see my toast. There are a couple bugs on this screen though, and they mostly have to do with our read listener and permissions, and you'll be fixing that up next. But for now, revel in the fact that you've logged in your first user. Also, if you go to the Auth tab, you'll be able to see them created here. Awesome work.